evening. Tonight in class we're going to be looking at two primary topics. The first is called PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and then a little later on we'll be looking at and examining the issues that surround physical and sexual assault. And Ginger will be coordinating part of that topic as we get into it later on. Let's find out, do we have anybody at the off-campus institutes? Darren, are you out there?
I'm out here.
Hello, Darren.
How you doing?
I'm fine. Do we have anybody up north tonight? Okay, we thought maybe Michelle, who is a former student, would turn up out there, and she may yet. So, you by yourself, Darren?
Yes.
Okay. Didn't know if you'd have your friend back from last week. Okay. Our first topic, as I indicated, is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Well, let's get a definition to work with on the front end here. PTSD is a psychic trauma. It's markedly distressing. It normally occurs in a situation like tornadoes, earthquakes, war, or physical, sexual abuse. Can you think of some other areas, some other things that might cause PTSD?
Would maybe death of a parent or an extremely close person maybe cause that? If you've had
maybe, if it's a really close bonding. Although usually it's something even more traumatic. You never know. We've always said meaning's in the mind of the receiver. And so that could be extremely traumatic for the person. Nancy?
When you mention, are you talking about earthquakes or just
an earthquake,
physical type trauma or crisis?
Well, certainly an earthquake is a good example. If you followed the San Francisco earthquake, what kinds of things were... It's one thing to have the ground shake under your feet. I mean, my daughter, who lived in Anchorage for a while, was awakened a few times and surprised to feel the building trembling, but it didn't cause PTSD. So it depends on the severity of the earthquake. But what happened in San Francisco that made that so much worse? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there were explosions from the gas lines, which I think a block of homes went up in flames, and just bridges collapsed on cars, and people had to be rescued, and there are all kinds of, different situations that were caused, I guess secondary situations from the initial earthquake.
Right, all kinds of situational crises that emerged out of the big crisis of the earthquake. But you've got trauma at this level that's above and beyond what most of us are accustomed to. From reading your papers and just from talking with other people, usually about the most any of us deal with that's unexpected is something like automobile wrecks. A student in a former class had a person die in her arms out on I-10 in the swamps while the other person went for help. She came up on the scene of the wreck, and she stayed while the other driver went for an ambulance, which took, 45 minutes. By the time you drive 20 minutes to make a phone call, and the ambulance driver figures out where to go to out there in the swamp and so forth. And so those things are more serious and greater than. And when freeways collapse and you know that just moments before there were cars of people there, and you may have blood dripping out of the concrete, or that's about, most of us are affected when we come up on a severe auto accident. There was one on 610 just a couple of nights ago, and the car had burned, and there were 3 ambulances and 49 tow trucks, and we kind of get used to that, even though it's temporarily unnerving. Melanie, what are you thinking?
On the way over here tonight on the news and the radio, there was a accident today. There was a fire caused by a wall heater, and 2 small children were trapped in the house, and the little girl and the little boy, they were 2 and 4, and the little boy died. And neighbors broke in to save them, and I think that the little girl might have post-traumatic stress disorder when she gets older by the trauma of the fire, and then watching her brother die right in front of her, maybe.
Yeah, that's above and beyond. Let's look at this next characteristic here. Number 3, outside the range of usual human experience. And of course, some of you have had more dramatic experiences than others have. You know, except for some car wrecks along the way, most of my experiences have been pretty routine. But in reading your papers, you know, one person looked out of their house to see their grandparents' garage in flames across the street, and the people survived, one pet didn't. But that's far more traumatic than fender benders in traffic. So things that are outside the range of usual human experience. I didn't even put, intentionally, I didn't put hurricane on the list. Now there are probably some people for whom a hurricane in Houston is a traumatic event. But some of us have gotten almost accustomed to them. Not that we like them, not that we would welcome them, but it's no more unnerving, for me at least so far, than a long thunderstorm. So why would a tornado be different? Or would it be different? Karen, what do you think?
Well, for me, I've experienced hurricanes, or I think they're maybe given another name on the West Coast, but, you know, and that's, especially as what you normally experience, it's just sort of more rain. It seems to be just somewhat scaled up version of stuff you experience all the time. I have never actually seen a tornado, and I, of course, previously lived in parts of the country where they don't normally occur, so I have to admit I'm still at the stage of, well, I don't want to do anybody any damage. I'm sort of mildly curious. I'd like to see one, like, laying in a field.
Did you see The Wizard of Oz?
Yeah, that's right.
Go back and look at that one.
So I'm figuring that's going to be exciting. But tornadoes are certainly less predictable,
Right.
and just more immediately, you know. And I think it's the unpredictability is a big part of the trauma, because, you know, you just don't know where and when, and they seem to be, even if in a fairly concentrated area, you know, can be really devastating for that one little area.
Right.
Being
Ginger?
from Kansas, we have a lot of tornadoes there, and just 4 or 5 years ago there was a really bad one that went through Andover, which is a suburb of Wichita where I'm from, and it cut a mile-wide swath right through the city, and the city's not, I mean, it's a little tiny bedroom community outside of Wichita. It was really devastating to watch, I mean, because news cameras were there seeing it happen. People were out with their video cameras, and it was insane, but it was traumatic for the state in general, but for our area, you know, people went to help, and it was a big crisis. It was a big deal because people lost everything, and it was a long time before people could go in and see if there was anything left. And everybody was affected because everybody knew somebody who lived there. It was a big enough. There were probably, 30,000 people who lived there, so it wasn't just minuscule, but still, a lot of people were affected. A lot of businesses and churches, and it's a big deal.
It's the unpredictability and the severity.
And the sirens didn't work that night, so it was really
We'll
bad.
get Julie and then Melanie.
In 92, we had tornadoes go through our neighborhood, and my mom and I were engrossed in a movie and didn't realize that there were even tornado warnings, and I always wondered, how do you know when there's a tornado? Believe me, you know, and I don't care to ever go through that again. Even though our house was untouched, I have friends that I grew up with, they lost their homes. You know, and how do you tell them, it's okay, but, it's like, well, I lost our photo books, and it just, I don't care
think
to
that's
ever,
probably the worst
ever
part,
go through another tornado.
If everyone comes out alive, the photo albums.
Yeah, that's one thing that used to be much over.
Melanie, what are you thinking?
That if you lived in Galveston and you lived on the beach in a house, a hurricane could wipe out your home.
Is a much more serious thing, and that's a good point. Yeah, Jackie.
I haven't been through a tornado where I lost something, but I feel like I could understand it because we had an incident when I was living in my parents' house where burglars came up with a moving van and literally took everything. Everything. I mean, they moved us out. Furniture, clothes, draperies, refrigerators. It was like the house was just totally wiped out, and consequently photo albums and stuff like that. So
They took all that too.
I mean, it was like somebody moved us. And we came home and there was nothing in the house except for the wall-to-wall carpeting. And it would be to me like a loss with a tornado. I mean, we had the house, but it was just the shell.
Yeah. But Ginger can remember, I'm sure, the morning that I called her right after Christmas. That, I may get a lump telling you this one, the house just a block behind me, less than a block, exploded from a gas leak. And I had heard, I was up about 6 a.m. because it was the holidays and I could have slept in, so I got up. You know how that goes. And I remember hearing a boom and feeling a little vibration and thinking, gee, I wonder what that was. But it wasn't that big. And then maybe 10 minutes later, hearing sirens, looking out the front door, and we're on a cul-de-sac, and seeing flames shooting higher than the trees. And I called her hysterical and said, my neighbor's house has blown up. I mean, I didn't know the people, but, you know, just had seen them in passing. But there was the whole, and it was gone within minutes. Gas leak in the kitchen, I think they said. And fortunately, the bedrooms were on the other end of the house. So when it exploded, they got out the windows. But virtually the clothes on their back, and that was it. Now, you know, the insurance has come through, and they've rebuilt the house over on North McGregor, and it's a bigger, prettier house than it was before, but all the special stuff's gone. Yeah. And so, while it's a memory for me that's still unnerving and slightly emotional, for those people, it has to be an incredible trauma. So, we're talking about things outside the range of human experience. And so number 4, point 4, suggests some of the things that can happen as a result of that. The event is persistently re-experienced. And when we get into sexual assault later on this evening, battering, heavy physical abuse, we'll see how some of this occurs. But there are things like intrusive memories. Now, what do we mean by intrusive memories?
Well, that's where you're just sitting doing something normally, and suddenly it's almost like you're getting a little flashback of, you know, you're right back in the situation.
You just can't get it out of your head. And some of you have written things in your papers that there's not a day that goes by that you don't remember a certain incident. And for most of you, now some of you are like me. You've led pretty easygoing lives, you know, fender benders and so forth are the worst of it. But some of you have dealt with some really heavy stuff already, deaths of special people, just losses in your life, traumatic things with parents that you would have preferred hadn't happened, and so forth. And so some people indicate that those things almost on a daily basis come back in. And that's not to say you're suffering from PTSD, but if those memories were coming back in such an intrusive way that you couldn't function, that you couldn't get your work done, you couldn't keep your schedule, they became overpowering, then we'd call them intrusive memories. Karen?
In fact, I have a sibling who has started experiencing that in the last year or two, and he doesn't know the source of these, doesn't know the source of the trauma, and is starting to try and question the family about maybe things that happened at an early age in his life, because he doesn't know why, but he says he'd be sitting there and suddenly, or like he's working in his office and somebody's doing some construction work and turns on music, and somehow it was the combination of music and a pounding, and suddenly he's in the middle of a memory, and he's seeing flashbacks of people and stuff, and doesn't know what it's about, but really wants to know.
How old is he?
He's
in the 20s, 30s?
He's in his 40s.
40s. I just want to, sometimes it's your 20s, at least, before repressed memories come back out. Something about being adult and being free and independent and able to take care of yourself. But
it can happen anytime.
Yeah, it can happen anytime. I'm thinking of someone about a year ago, a woman in her 20s who had been sexually abused and was in her early 20s before those memories were freed up enough that she could let them back in. And she got counseling, and she's doing a lot better. But, you know, there were 2 or 3 months there that were a real mess until she worked through all that and got enough of the memory back to complete, she thinks, the picture and portrait of what was happening. Okay, nightmares. You know, some of us dream really goofy stuff anyway, but when you're waking up terrified from nightmares and the nightmares repeat themselves and they repeat the theme of the trauma, then that's another indicator. Allison?
Well, I was just going to share an experience. Speaking of reoccurring dreams, I really don't know why, but for about 4 years ago, I started having these reoccurring nightmares where my friend Jennifer and I were driving in a car, and she would always be driving, but no matter what happened, we would always end up going off the side of a bridge or a road into a bayou or something. And of course, I would wake up before I hit the ground, but I was never in an accident with her or anything like that. But I had these reoccurring dreams that would scare me to death for like 6 to 8 months, and then they finally went away. And
well, that's good.
Yeah, but it was really strange.
Yeah. Sometimes if you go back, and I don't know anything about dream analysis, so we're not going to touch that one. You know. But sometimes if you go back and think about the dream and analyze it yourself, then you can figure out bits and pieces from the day or the week, or at least I can, and say, okay, we talked about this and we talked about that and such happened. And I could see how my brain could put all of that together and come up with this really ridiculous dream. And even though it's not logical, it's just kind of like taking the garbage of the day and stirring it all together and making something out of it.
I have a question for you. So that kind of like PTSD, can people have that in varying degrees and stuff, or is it just because I feel like that way when I get really, really stressed out and I don't have control of myself. I start dreaming about the things that happened with my parents and stuff. And remember how I told you how sometimes I feel like I'm hitting my dad and I'm just not getting anywhere, but then other times when I'm in control, I don't have any of that dreams and stuff, So is that like a kind of form of
well, remember we used the word at the beginning of the semester, trans crisis, and there's some crises that just kind of reemerge now and then, and I wonder if what's happening to you isn't more at that end of the continuum. It's an old crisis that gets triggered a little bit, and so it reemerges. If you're to the point of almost being in trauma again, of not being able to function, then it's over at a more serious point on the continuum. And most of the people, as I understand it, that are treated for PTSD are almost immobile, or they have moments of periods, not moments, but periods of immobility. And so if the trauma reoccurs in such a way that it's incapacitating, then it's at one point on the continuum. And if it's something that just causes an old painful memory to come back, that's just what memories are about. And some memories don't ever go away. And the more unpleasant and painful they were, and even pleasant painful, there's some things that partings or tender sweet moments, there's some things that hurt even though they're nice, and those don't go away either. And there may be things that trigger that, smells, colors, combinations of events. And you wish you could go back and recapture that moment. And you can't, and so it hurts because you can't. Okay, flashbacks. What's the difference between a flashback and an intrusive memory? Robert?
A flashback can be not necessarily a traumatic experience, right? Correct? I mean, it doesn't have to be something that was negative, but yet intrusive, and that's something that's...
It's kind of a loaded question because I think the line's real thin.
Okay.
But the flashback is more likely to cause the event to literally replay in your mind, where a memory may be more of an abstraction. We don't have to sort this out on a test, but an intrusive memory, you may be getting bits and pieces of something, and the flashback would be more like reliving it. Karen and then Jack.
Yeah, and I think flashback is certainly seemingly the more dramatic. It's the kind we're always seeing when, unfortunately it's the stereotype of Vietnam vets in crisis, and so they're all having flashbacks, and they're all suffering from PTSD, and that's certainly what we always see portrayed on TV. Is
we're going to talk about the
major flashback thing.
Okay, Jacqueline?
I would think of the intrusive memory as something that slowly comes back, that you keep thinking about bits and pieces of it, and a flashback would be like a complete picture in your mind, like you're actually seeing it.
Right, like you've just been transported, time warped right back into it. Okay, sensory hallucinations.
Wouldn't that be like kind of like smelling something that was from that era, or like, I don't know, the Vietnam vets, they smell like the decay and the jungle and, the smell of fire and stuff that might have been there, that they associate with that.
Okay, it doesn't have to be just smell, maybe visual as well, but go ahead.
What about like if they all of a sudden break out in sweats and they have this surge to run or something? Would that be like a...
Okay, that may be a response. Let's put this next one up. Because what you're referring to is number 6. The victim may react physically or physiologically. And breaking out in a sweat, having the inclination to hit the floor or whatever. The sensory hallucinations may involve vision, may involve smell, but go ahead, Karen.
Well, in fact, it almost sounds like you've got a continuum here. You've got the mild version being intrusive memory, flashbacks stronger, and sensory hallucination is just sort of the most extreme version of that. It's no longer, intrusive memory, you're sort of getting little bits and pieces. Flashback, you're seeing a movie of it. Sensory hallucination, you're there.
Yeah, it's happening all over again. The bombs are dropping, the cars are crashing, whatever the trauma, the tornado is hitting. And so a severe thunderstorm might produce the hallucination that you're in a tornado again. And I didn't hear you. And trains, yes. Now those of you, I've had a little one go over, that's all. It tops some trees down along the bayou and all, but it's I'm told, and it seemed that night, it's having a tornado go over is much like having a train run over the top of your house.
Sometime in thunderstorms, if there's a long rolling thunder, I'll listen, and I'm listening not only for the length of it, but I remember hearing almost a whirling also, and I'm listening for that. I mean,
there's
even if
rush.
The sky's not green and there's no tornado warnings, I'm listening for that sound.
The combination of the rumble and the rush.
Because they can't always tell you when they're coming.
And which way they're coming. Okay. Number 5 says the PTSD victim tries to avoid stimuli that recreates the trauma. That makes sense. We'll stay out. We'll go to the cellar and stay away from the tornadoes or whatever. Sometimes we're simply avoiding the situation. But then other things that may happen are things like repression, detachment, numbing. With repression, what's going on?
Kind of like trying to forget it. You put it way back far in your mind so you can't remember it.
Yeah, remember psychoanalytic theory on the exam? But Freud was very interested and how repressed memories impacted our behavior. Things that are buried in our unconscious. Now, he had some other stuff that we don't subscribe to as much as folks used to. But the idea of repression comes out of psychoanalytic theory, and says that there are some things that are so unbearable, so unpleasant, that we just block them out completely. And sometimes it takes therapy of different sorts. It may take hypnosis, something like that, to bring those events back to the surface. Kara?
Of course, it would seem like, why bother? If it was a nasty thing, you don't want to deal with it, why not leave it back in the closet? And I assume that we must be assuming that even though it's theoretically buried and we don't know it's there, it's influencing current behavior.
Right. Maybe you've got newlyweds that are having sexual difficulties, and they can't figure out why, and so they go in for counseling, they go in for therapy, and then they discover at some point, well, the girl was raped in junior high, or sexually abused in elementary school, or whatever.
Or the guy was.
Or the guy. Yeah, it works both ways. And so, yeah, normally you wouldn't go back looking for something unless there's an effect out here that's negative. But then sometimes, and I'm thinking of the one student in class I mentioned a while ago, that the memories just started coming back. And I don't know why. I don't know her well enough to know what might have precipitated that. But here she was in college, and here came strange memories that became intrusive, that didn't make sense, and then began to make sense, and eventually necessitated some therapy and so on. Okay, detachment, what's going on there? Go ahead.
And that's clearly a defense mechanism. It's just like, and that really could, get kind of disagreeable for the rest of your life, because one way of dealing with things that feel unpleasant, okay, well, we'll just sort of stop. We'll just back off and kind of get some distance from feeling much of anything or caring about much of anybody, or and that would be really maybe a little traumatic for the rest of your family, who's suddenly going, why don't you look like you care about us?
Okay, and it may be very closely related to numbing. That emotionally you become numb to the situation. If there's an older sibling abusing younger ones, or a stronger, usually it's older, younger, but, well, I don't even know if that's a true generalization. But anyway, there may be situations where you feel helpless enough, and particularly with children, that you don't think you're going to get any help. And if it's your own parents abusing you, then, who do you go to? Do you tell grandma? Do you tell the next door neighbor? Sometimes, yes, with good results, but other times it's just easier to shut down emotionally and say it doesn't matter. And I've had students tell me, this is only a body. I don't care what you do to it. The real me is up here. And so they've almost disassociated the mind from the body. Now, whether that's a rationalization for some behavior or whether it's a necessary defense mechanism, I could sit here and attribute causes. Remember that test question, attribution theory? How I respond is in part influenced by what kind of cause I attribute there. Did this person just want to be promiscuous anyway? Or is this a person with a significant problem and this is the only way they know how to deal with it, etc. But numbing, and then related to that, may be detachment. Of just developing a sense of apathy, of shutting down emotionally, so it doesn't matter. And then when we go back and look at systems theory and the interdependence notion, it may be that if you're part of a family system that is so dysfunctional, you just have to become detached. If you're not independent, you don't have the money and the resources to move out on your own, then you have to stay in that environment, even though you know your father is abusing a sibling, or one sibling is abusing another, or whatever terrible combination is going on. You've got an alcoholic in the family that's physically abusing every person around. That the only thing you can do is just be detached, try to be innocuous, and survive until you graduate from high school or get a job or get a plan that gets you out of that situation. Okay, we put on number 6 that the victim may react physically or physiologically, because this may be external or internal or a combination of the two, and I kind of wanted to get at that. Sometimes the reaction is overt. You just sit there and shake and you can't move. Other times it's more of an internal reaction. You get ulcers. Can you think of other examples of things that might happen? Robert?
Cancer.
Okay.
Like maybe attributed to cancer. Well, maybe not, but I mean,
There's some
I think that it would cause cancer, like living in that kind of traumatic situation every day and stuff like that.
Okay, there's some suggestion in the research that high stress levels at least increase your vulnerability and make it more difficult for you to fight off any kind of germ, and certainly cancer could fit in there.
Well, I mean, as far as the ulcer, that's definitely true, because I've gone through so much stress and stuff that it finally caught up with me 3 weeks ago, and now I have an ulcer, and I shouldn't have an ulcer at 21. I shouldn't have to
You're
worry
right.
about an ulcer and gallbladder problems, which shouldn't even be anywhere. And then you get that way. I mean, I've never ever gotten sick in my whole life, but it's my body's way of telling me, you need to start taking care of yourself.
And paying attention. Yeah, good. Karen?
Well, another reaction to that, of course, would be like blood pressure would be, because, that's certainly a normal reaction to stress is your blood pressure elevates, and that's normally part of a defense mechanism. But if it's a situation where you can't do anything about it, now you're stuck, you can end up with permanently elevated blood pressure and ultimately heart problems, or all the things that derive from that.
Jacqueline?
Wouldn't some people get like nervous tics as a reaction to some stress?
Mm-hmm. Certainly could. Okay, we'll move along. Okay, the PTSD victim will have persistent symptoms of increased nervous system arousal. Okay, we're looking for a total picture here of things. We all, or most of us, get insomnia from time to time. You just have a restless night. You have what I call busy brain, and you can't get to sleep. But the person with PTSD will have these symptoms regularly, persistently. And so nervous system arousal may include insomnia, outbursts of anger, the inability to concentrate, hypervigilance. What do we mean by hypervigilance? Okay.
I would call them like goosey. They would jump at the slightest provocation. I mean, if they heard a tap sound, they'd jump.
Okay. Yeah, just on red alert, kind of. Well, my brother was in Vietnam, and we're going to talk more about vets in a minute. And overall, he came back well adjusted and merged back in. Ginger's met him. He's an okay guy now, years later. And I was away in college when he first came home. And in those days, planes broke the sound barriers a lot. And you got those sonic booms fairly regularly. And the first few weeks for sure, and then periodically after that, every time that boom occurred, he hit the floor because it was like a bomb going off, and the reaction was so fast that he didn't even have time to think about it. You hear a boom, you hit the ground. You know, of course, it unnerved my poor mother mercilessly. You know, her baby's hitting the floor, her 6'3" baby. You know, but hypervigilance just keeps you wired all the time.
I know somebody that goes through that terrible stress every 4th of July with the fireworks, to the point where he will avoid any places that have that boom sound when they have those displays.
Is it the result of a trauma that does
It's
that?
Vietnam.
Okay. I mean, because I just don't like firecrackers and balloons popping. And, you know, I'll jump and have been driven almost to the point of tears a few times with an unexpected bang. But unless I've got something really repressed that I don't know about, you know, I'm one of those people who doesn't like loud bangs. So don't bring your firecrackers to class. Okay. And then overreacting to non-threatening stimuli. In the example I gave you, the sonic boom is certainly non-threatening. Even firecrackers are non-threatening. But if they're producing that physiological response, then that's an increased nervous system arousal. Okay, we've alluded to the Vietnam vets. Let's look at that a little more specifically. There's some good material in your book, and all of this section you'll recognize as adapted from the textbook. But the studies on the Vietnam vets are considered the archetypes of PTSD. And unfortunately, many of the veterans were not adequately treated in the beginning. There were people from World War II and others that were, and from other tragedies and traumas and so forth, that were victims of PTSD, but there wasn't enough accumulated data until Vietnam for people to recognize it and say, okay, we've actually got a collective problem here with characteristics like we've just talked about. They tried to determine that the people were really psychologically unbalanced to start with, and so they were overreacting to things, or they were exaggerating things because they wanted disability insurance, or, you know, it was just sloppily handled and not adequately treated. Okay, there's an interesting conclusion in your book that says man-made traumas create more PTSD victims than acts of God. Somehow, not that, I mean, we do get PTSD, folks, out of acts of God, from tornadoes, earthquakes, and so forth. But the research that's been done suggests that it's harder for people to recover if it's man-made. If it's Holocaust survivors, if it's rape victims, children of murdered parents, victims of incest, war-related. There's something about people doing it to each other that seems to just make it worse than saying, well, it was an act of nature that the tree fell in my bedroom while I was sleeping. Robert?
Could that possibly be from the fact that in nature it doesn't have maybe a personality or a thought, but yet the person has ability to say yes or no? In other words, volition, to be able to do what they're doing.
I think so. The randomness of a tree falling just somehow seems easier for people to, or this portion of the freeway collapsing is easier to deal with than the idea that somebody would intentionally inflict harm on another human being. Yeah.
I think that's definitely true, because now if I'm ever in any kind of situation with any kind of mail or anybody says anything criticizing me, I take it extremely personal. I mean, when something else happens, you know, like a car wreck or whatever, that's not something that somebody did personally to me, you know.
Oh, I don't know. It was a total idiot that ran the red light and hit me.
That kind of stuff. But
somebody else has one of those stories.
But like, you know, because my dad did this to me, you know, I take it real personal. You know, I'm like,
sure.
Why did you do it to me? You know.
Okay, here comes this word hypervigilance again, and it was a particularly applicable term to describe what the Vietnam vets were going through, because that was a peculiar war. I don't know how many of you have parents or brothers or people in it, but, feel free to add on here. There was no front line. In World War II, they always knew where the line was in Europe and which beach they were on and whether they were going forward or backward. You could just see the lines. Also, in Europe, platoons or groups, I don't know what all the groups are called, but units would move in and units would move out. And they might, haul them back out to an aircraft carrier or something, or get them behind the line so they were safe and they could rest. And in Vietnam, there was no line and there was no relief. Where do you go if you absolutely need to sleep? Jacqueline?
Do you think it was exacerbated by the use of drugs too at that time?
Yeah, we're going to come to that. So hang on to that.
I think not just that, but I'm not sure exactly all that happened because I wasn't around that time.
You weren't even here yet.
I wasn't here yet. But wasn't it also really hard for people because it was never accepted as a war until much later on? I mean, that was real hard for them to accept that all these people died and it's not even considered a war.
No, it was sort of a political engagement or something.
Police action.
A police action. That term was often used too. Okay, so for many, number 3, there was no feeling of accomplishment. So they felt betrayed, the war had no goal, and the success was measured in body counts. Can you remember that? Or if you weren't here, do you remember hearing about that? Karen?
And what's worse, of course, is they later discovered that a lot of the body counts were also fictional. They created those to try and make people at home feel like something was happening, and they've since come. And so for people who were close enough to the scene to have known that a lot of that stuff was bogus, that's got to make it worse too.
Jacqueline?
Well, another thing that I remember a lot of people that went over to Vietnam were talking about was when their buddies were let go and they could go back home, people actually spit on them and treated them like criminals.
When they came home.
And that, they wrote letters back to their buddies, and it really killed the morale over there for the rest of the soldiers.
Yeah, really? Yeah, Allison.
Well, and something my mother brought up was also that back then when the soldiers finally did come home from Vietnam, and the way the veterans were treated then compared to the way the Gulf War veterans are treated now was significantly different, and I think that was even a more serious action than this Gulf War, in my opinion, and, there was even less praise then. So.
Right. I think with the Persian Gulf War, we were trying to do penance and make amends. People realized they blew it on Vietnam, and now, half a generation later, people are embarrassed and they're sorry. And so there, some amends were made by doing the Vietnam Memorial, which is a nice gesture. It fixes some stuff, makes some people better.
But they're just now doing a Korean War memorial, and it was just a police action. And they just acted like nothing happened when they came home. They didn't get spit on, but because my dad was in the Korean War, but nobody cared. Like, yeah, so, and a lot of people died, but until MASH came out, then people cared about it.
Yeah. Whatever it takes. Yes.
Also, Vietnam War was really the first televised war, like in World War I and II. I mean, you had the newsreels or something, and they didn't really get to see all the intricate details. But in the Vietnam War, I mean, we saw it on TV all the time.
And then
So
with
it really
Persian
brought it
Gulf,
home.
you saw Baghdad as it was bombed. That was weird. Robert.
The part where the little Vietnamese person was running down the street on fire on the television. I was watching a clip that from they were showing a live footage from the Vietnam War, and there was this little Vietnamese child that was running down the street on fire, and I was like, getting back to what she was saying, is the first televised war. You see both sides of the situation or whatever.
And that becomes awkward because it leads into, kind of point 4 and then the point 6 on the next one. The veterans were both the victims and the victimizers. They were a victim one minute, an aggressor the next, sometimes within seconds. Enemies couldn't be distinguished from allies. And here comes number 6. Which says the women and children were potentially lethal. So, you know, when you see a child on fire, part of your heart goes out, this is a terrible thing, and yet there's no trust, because had that child lived, they might have bombed someone else. Did y'all get all of 3, 4, 5, or did we talk so much you missed it? Okay, let's back up. I'll put it back up for a minute. Okay. 5 is enemies couldn't be distinguished from allies, and the victim-victimizer issue. Was there a hand up? No. Oh, Melanie, okay.
I missed number 2.
Number 2, what did number 2 say? Oh, that was hypervigilance, that in Vietnam there was no front line and no relief. You know, there was no place to go. You're physically exhausted, and where can you even sleep for 15 minutes safely? Do you climb up a tree? Do you try to bury yourself under brush and hope you don't snore?
Or dig into a mine.
Or dig into a mine? Or have someone step on you? Yeah. Okay. So body counts, the interchangeable roles that were so confusing, the inability to distinguish enemies from allies, and probably for the first time for Americans at least, to have women and children being lethal. Because, you know, a Civil War, the men wore their fancy uniforms and all lined up and marched right out in the field and blew each other away. And, yeah, Melanie. Move it up. The other way. That's my right. Is that where you want it? Okay. Okay, Allison, go ahead.
Also, in the Vietnam War, wasn't it, since you brought up the Civil War, wasn't it similar in the fact that there was a lot of face-to-face combat? I mean, really, where you were able to see your enemy versus just throwing bombs at an empty space that you were hoping, you know what I'm saying? So that could cause even...
Well, if the war movies are accurate.
Right.
You know, and to a point. But the idea, you meet someone on a bridge, and you don't know if that's a friend or if they're going to kill you. Karen?
A history professor here at U of H who said we could draw some useful analogies, and he was using that a war in Vietnam resembled most was possibly the Revolutionary War from the British perspective. For them, it was a lot like for what it was for us in Vietnam, in the sense of just like the British here, they couldn't distinguish friends from allies. You didn't, so they had a hard time going after people they think were causing problems because they might end up, you know, alienating people who were potential allies, and you know, not, you know, they were marching through the woods in just nice little unit formations, nice bright red coats.
They were playing according to the rules of the game,
and Americans, you know, had decided to, you know, take pot shots at them from behind.
Was it the French that taught us how to?
So you know, and that gave me a whole new perspective on, wow, from the British perspective, you know, that I mean. If we go back to several hundred years.
Should we go back and feel sorry for the British?
No, but it is a perspective on.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, yes, then the problems that and based on that, that's got to be probably the hardest thing. You just don't know who's going to be dangerous to you, so you don't dare trust anybody.
Okay. 7 was there. Did you have something, Jay? Excuse me.
Just going to say, I have a friend that he's deceased now, but he would constantly say that even when you shot the enemy, because they were so drugged up, you could shoot their legs off and they still came at you, and he could never get that burning vision out of his mind. They kept coming. I mean, they should have been dead, but they just kept coming. I mean, you couldn't kill them.
The kamikaze mentality. Yeah. And that has to be unnerving. I mean, the whole thing is unnerving. Okay. Number 7, the replacements were piecemeal. Whereas in World War II, my understanding is they move by units. And you pull out a whole unit, you send in a new unit. In many instances, if you look at number 8 also, the soldiers entered and exited the war singularly, and this reduced the bonding in the unit. Sometimes you didn't even know all the people in your unit. There was a poor support system. This way, it's just like, you're here, get out there on the line and fight. I mean, I don't know exactly that that's how it went. But the conclusions, at least from your book and other sources, say that they fought alone, they went home alone, they might be on the, I started to say the front line, but you don't know where the line is. They might be in live action and 48 hours later be home on the front porch in the swing.
I had a friend that was a Navy pilot in Vietnam, and they actually told them not to make friends with the Marines, you know, when they would encounter them or whatever, because so many of them would die. And so some of that was encouraged by the military.
Yeah, because it's harder to handle when you're emotionally attached. But then it's also harder to survive when you're not emotionally attached. And there's no bonding. So, but you know how jet lag can affect you. I mean, you go to a convention or something and come back home and you're disoriented, or at least I am sort of, you know, maybe not totally disoriented, but not in full sync. And to go from the middle of a war, get on a bumpy plane and turbulence all the way across the Pacific would constitute trauma for a lot of us. And then you're just plopped from one culture into another, from one environment into another. It's very, very difficult. Okay, somebody mentioned substance abuse a while ago, and that's number 9 on this list. Substance abuse was easy, and it provided a numbing escape, and for many it had severe consequences. They came home addicts. And then we've mentioned already, you've mentioned what I have up here as number 10, that the anti-war sentiments at home resulted in prejudice and rejection of the veterans. But I can certainly understand how that would happen. That whatever made it easier to numb up and deal with. Okay? Yeah.
Well, in fact, my late husband was in the Marine Corps, and during that time, and I remember, I mean, that's something that was traumatic enough for people in the military that it affected, colored their thinking about things for a long time. I remember him asking a cousin of mine who came home from the Army, you know, we're talking 10 years later, and him asking him, did you wear your uniform home? Did they give you any trouble? Because obviously there had been enough impact of, I mean, during the height of Vietnam, they basically told people going home, don't wear your uniform. Make sure you've changed before you get off the plane in the U.S. You know, you don't want, because, I mean, you know, there'd been enough people attacked and abused and everything else. And obviously, I mean, that memory lingered long enough that 10 years later they're still asking, are you getting any hassle by wearing a uniform?
Good point. Okay, we've got some maladaptive patterns here. These particularly apply to Vietnam veterans, but they would apply to other PTSD survivors as well. What are we talking about with the notion of death imprint? Book talks about death imprint. Melanie? We'll find out who's read the chapter. Uh-oh. Maybe somebody needs to look it up.
Well, I'm not even gonna guess. I have an idea.
Well, throw something out. What do you think would happen?
A death imprint, in my mind, would be just in your mind the I don't want to say a picture, but the imprint. I mean, it never goes away. The death of someone is so strong that it's always there, and it's just the vision, maybe, of it.
Okay. You want to help her out, Jacqueline? Did you find it there? Oh, yeah. Or did you look it up?
It caught me.
Oh. Well, no, that's good. I'm glad somebody brought a book and can find things. Allison?
Well, would it be a combination of like the sensory problems as well as maybe like a moral psychological problem too, knowing that you were surrounded by death, or you participated in the death of someone else, or something like that?
Y'all are punting real well here. I think I'll just wait on this one. Let's see if they can find it. Darren, have you read this chapter?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
179.
Page 179. Read it for them. Or are you faking me out?
It just talks about like the normal, the boundaries between like the feeling of being suspended between living and dying, and how some of the veterans, how they already felt dead, and it's kind of like a collision path with law enforcement and their employers and their families. It's something that they kind of predicting their own future.
Okay, good. You want to add on?
Are you kind of talking about in this, there's some things worse than dying? That surviving and, having to see that imprint of death?
Okay, well, now you're kind of moving into number 2, survivor's guilt. Yeah, but the death imprint kind of has 2 parts to it, and involves this notion of you've seen so much death around you, much of which is far more traumatizing. I mean, it's not like a nice clean death in a hospital. Not that that's pleasant, but if you've seen the really gross Vietnam movies where body parts are blown everywhere, there's that imprint of death, that picture of death that is just planted in your brain that's there. And
Clock has stopped.
oh, the clock has stopped. We have no idea what time it is.
It's 8 o'clock.
It's 8 o'clock. Okay, that's fine. Okay. We're clock watchers in here. Okay. So there's that imprint, that mental stamp on your brain of all the trauma of death that's around you. And then there may be a kind of death wish that goes along with that as well, that you wish you could have died rather than, that would be the preferable alternative to surviving. So, and then that feeds into number 2 of survivor's guilt. And that guilt can occur in other situations, not just PTSD victims that have guilt. You may find if you work with cancer patients that you may end up feeling guilty because you have hair and they've lost theirs to chemotherapy. Or you may feel guilty for being healthy. You're grateful, but you also feel guilty for being healthy when all these other people are so ill. And so for those who survive something as traumatic as Vietnam, there may have been, and often was, a substantial degree of guilt that occurred because they made it. Or the same kind of thing may happen in an auto accident. One person lives and all the others die, and you feel guilty that you survived. Mm-hmm.
Don't you think that the trauma units, like in Ben Taub, would have that same reaction with the triage nurses and the interns, where they're constantly seeing that
they would feel guilty for being alive?
Well, I mean, I know from some friends that were interns, all they could talk about was when they had to do the ER time, and they had to see the shooting victims and the stabbing victims. It was just blood and death going on constantly, and they didn't know if they could save their lives or what. It seemed like they were going through a trauma in their own.
No, and it would make you count your blessings and at the same time feel very vulnerable. Allison?
To add on her point, I think they become desensitized after a while to it. But on another topic about survivor's guilt, I recently have had a good friend pass from having AIDS in October, and his lover felt very guilty about the fact that he did not have AIDS and his lover did, and therefore died, and he had to watch and participate, and often told me that he wished he could just die right along with him because it was a lot better than watching him die and surviving afterwards. So,
and anytime you lose a friend, there's a special pain there. Mm-hmm.
Something probably along the lines we were talking about a paper, or talking about some instances where my 2-year-old fell down the stairs and then hit his head, and there was just an extreme, excessive amount of blood loss. Well, just the other day, my he's now almost 10-year-old said, I was at the top of the stairs, and I always thought I could have caught him. And that guilt, and we were able to talk to him about it, and we said, could you really have done it? And he said, no, it just happened so fast. But it's amazing, those things, at an age like that, when it's really young, how you might, they might have some effect on, some other kind of trauma.
And put yourself on a guilt trip that shouldn't even be there. Sometimes we should feel guilty, but other times not. Okay, desensitization.
That's the part about feeling guilty.
Okay.
It's kind of fun when I talk like that.
You like talking? Go ahead. We're happy to hear from you.
Like the book gave the example of the people that are in their own way, they're afraid of guns, but their only way of coping with it is the guy, he has the massive gun collection, and that's his way of, escaping the fears, just to combat it with, the same way.
Okay. Nancy?
Also, it might be a period where you cannot cry or show, any kind of deep emotion, where tears just don't come to your eyes over anything.
Okay, and sometimes you're just desensitized, the numbing takes place. Okay, estrangement, what's going on when that happens? Karen?
Probably, you think, especially in terms of Vietnam, it's you've lost enough people that you became close to, even if they were just like buddies in your unit, that after a while you start associating to care about people is to lose them. So if I don't care, then I won't get the pain later. And I'm sure that's what happened to a lot of families when people came home and then decided that I'm just going to try and retreat and not have those feelings there, so I'm not vulnerable, and therefore I'm not going to experience that pain again. And, for the family who's been at home, waiting for them to come home, can't wait, and suddenly they're, now suddenly they go to reach out and they hit a wall. That's all.
And some families were waiting readily for them to come home, and other families went on about their business, and it was like, oh, you're back, and you're a different person. What do we do with you now? We're glad you're home, but we don't know you anymore. And so there were all kinds of problems like that, too. Okay, emotional, we misspelled one there. Emotional, no we didn't, enmeshment. It didn't look right for a minute. Okay, what's happening with that? Nancy?
Well, naturally you'd feel a lot more intimacy with someone that had been through what you did, and they would understand, whereas someone who was sitting back, in suburbia in the United States, with not anywhere near that trauma, they couldn't relate to it. So it would be, you could see there would be an estrangement to those that previously were the closest to you.
Right. And that's why in a lot of the support groups for veterans that they need to go to a VA hospital, they need to go to people who understand what actually took place. And that would be their response. My wife my spouse can't understand this. I have to go find people who live through this phenomenon the same way that I did. And that's proved to be a very useful and valuable tool in therapy and helping a number of people work through. Okay, and then just kind of a final note on this topic. Children react differently to trauma because they lack full cognitive and moral development. Have any idea what we're talking about here? What would children do differently? Melanie?
They don't quite understand exactly what's going on. If they have a parent or a sibling or a friend that dies, immediately they might think they're just gone. They're just gone. And then as time goes on, they don't come back. Then they ask where they are. You know, they don't understand.
Right. And when the chaplain comes, we'll talk more with Dr. Fry about that too, because he works a lot with the children at MD Anderson as well as adult patients. But children often have a more accepting view of death, and they are often willing to accept the fact that they're going to die before their parents will own it. But then children may also distort things and think that they caused the death or that they caused the trauma in some way. And so they'll cognitively distort things because they don't have the maturity to understand cause and effect.
You know, that's considered a common occurrence in divorce, that children, especially, you know, probably school age and below, like elementary school age and whatever, are very prone to coming to the conclusion that they have caused their parents' divorce and feeling guilt over it and getting them to admit that and trying to persuade them that they aren't, because, you know, if they said something to somebody, you know, they were the last person to say something and then the person's gone, it's, you know, not an unreasonable assumption for a little person to kind of figure, I did this, X happened, I must have caused X. You know?
And if they just said something like, I hate you, and then the person went out and had a fatal car accident, they might commit that. What were you going to say, Jacqueline?
Well, it's kind of like I was going to say, that a lot of them, not a lot, but some will feel anger that they've been abandoned. How dare they leave me?
Yeah, and we all feel that, or may feel that.
And it definitely happens, like with child abuse and sexual abuse. A little girl is told, you know, that you're a bad girl if you tell anybody that this happened, you know, because it was your fault. She's going to feel that the abuse was her fault. You know, it was nothing that he did. She's the one that caused it. So they carry that own guilt until somebody tells them later on in life that, you know, you were not the one that caused it.
And that's a good transition as we start to move on into this other material. The idea of whether or not your being bad justifies abuse, whether or not you can be held liable, or in your own mind, whether you should be blaming yourself and held accountable for something. There's a wide continuum on physical abuse, from smacking a kid with a hand to taking a belt or a board and beating on them, to taking your fist and beating them up, to sexually abusing or the assault of adults. You know, we've got a wide range there. Where is the line? You know, maybe we need to think about that, or maybe not even trying to draw the line. I guess cognitively we need to ask where is the line, although we probably don't know where to draw it. Can you understand how people get angry enough to hit one another? I mean, over here we've said battering is bad. That's not okay. You know, is it okay to spank your children? Is it okay? I mean, there's some parents who never lay a hand on a child. Well, is it okay to smack them now and then if you don't whip them? You know, what kind of factors do we have going on here, Karen?
Well, I was just going to bring up the fact of this conflict that we have within our society of even agreement on. There was after all, the woman who was being hauled in court because her child had, I think, from the way I've heard her describe it, I mean, on news reports and stuff, was saying her child had been persistently whining for something she had been told no, and was continuing to make everyone else in the store miserable as they listened to this person whine and carry on, and so she apparently slapped her child across the face once, and the people in the store were outraged and called the police or whatever, and the woman was going to be tried for child abuse for slapping her child, and she was just kind of astonished that with all the other terrible things we've done to children, that this slap
we leave them on the street starving to death.
Yes, and I'm going, and I'm simply trying to persuade my child, who seemingly is finally kind of gotten out of control here. I'm trying to kind of bring him up short and say, whoops, this is wrong, and everyone else is going to judge that So it is a problem in the sense of we don't want to ever leave people thinking that it's okay to go around abusing people, but yet somewhere you do want a society that allows parents to discipline their children, because I have to admit I've started to feel like society has almost gone too far the other way, and that sometimes, because I hear so many little children and teenagers telling their parents, using it almost as a threat, if you punish me I will call child protective
Spank me
silence
and I'll
services.
call 911.
I'll call child. No, I've heard kids say that. I mean it.
Yes.
Allison?
I was just going to say, I think a lot of it has to do with how generations of people have been socialized and brought up by their parents, because I'm not saying physical abuse or mental abuse in any way is right, but, like with my dad was always one that he was a very authoritative person, and, if you did something wrong, you were going to get whipped on the naked bottom with a leather belt. And I can remember one specific Christmas Eve that I sat in the bathroom and refused to talk to him because he threatened me with the belt because I had put cologne on my shoes. He had repeatedly told me not to, but I did it anyway, and thought that no one could smell it except me. But anyway, I was like about 6 years old.
Limited cognitive development.
But my point is that also, he didn't see anything wrong with that. But now in today's society, if I was to bring that up, people say, oh, that's child abuse, and there are limiting factors. And I think it just depends also, he brought us up to, he threatened us, don't you cry or I'll give you something to cry about. And that to me is a very bad thing. When my younger sister was growing up and I was babysitting, that's when I realized, I can't repeat his things.
You don't want to repeat those
These
patterns.
are very bad, and I even felt bad for making her, stand in a corner, because I thought that's what the punishment she should have as a child trying to be an adult and take care of a kid. That was very wrong of me too. I felt really guilty for a long time because she cried and cried and cried while she stood in that corner.
Okay, well let's hold on this thought and think about this. What drives people to the point of physically striking one another? Where some of those lines might be, and particularly we're going to go over and look at what it's like to be way over the line on assault.